So again, welcome to our session on equitable, sustainable, and resilient infrastructure for coastal communities. The way we're going to do this is we have a couple of individual talks from our panelists. We'll hopefully leave a little bit of time after each talk for one or two questions from the audience, but then we'll have a few minutes at the end for questions for everyone on the panel. So I'm going to kick us off. My name's Kelsea Best. I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Maryland in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. I'll be starting as an assistant professor in civil, environmental, and geodetic engineering at Ohio State University in the fall. And really, I wanted to kick us off by just posing some general thoughts about climate change and affordable housing, and trying to get us to start thinking about how climate change and affordable housing interact, and how those interactions might have implications for equitable adaptation. So as I'm sure we all know, the motivation for the work that a lot of us are doing is that climate change is expected to increase the intensity and frequency of certain natural hazards. So those might be slow onset hazards such as sea level rise, encroaching salinity, and also rapid events such as hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, etc. And at the same time, the US is experiencing a severe housing affordability crisis. So how do we think about how the impending climate crisis and housing affordability crisis might interact? And what does that mean for the most vulnerable people in our communities? And I'll argue that we should especially be thinking about renters when we have these conversations. I think too often we think primarily about homeowners, but renters are an especially vulnerable population. So to set the scene, there was a recent study that showed that across the United States in 2022, there were only 36 available affordable rental unit homes for every 100 extremely low income renters. So that gap in affordable housing is prevalent across the country, though not evenly. This map shows in the shading how many hours of a minimum wage job per week someone would need to work to afford a one-bedroom rental housing unit per state. So the darker shading is more hours. You can see that that goes up to as much as 114 hours per week, and the low end of this scale is 43 hours at minimum wage, just to show you really how inaffordable housing is in this country. And I also want to point out that some of the cities where this crisis is most severe are places that we do think of as especially climate vulnerable, and especially some of these major coastal cities, such as Houston, Miami, and of course, New York City. So this is a conceptual framework that I use to think about overlapping vulnerabilities and how they relate to climate change and housing. So the first thing that we know is that historically marginalized communities, so racial minorities, low-income groups, older people, women, etc., are generally facing higher levels of exposure to climate change. And so this means that they're living in areas that have more risk of climate effects and more severe impacts. So that includes living in floodplains, areas that are more susceptible to extreme heat, etc. And I want to emphasize that this is not by accident. So this occurs because of historic and systemic exclusion, racism in our housing markets, things like redlining and exclusionary zoning and institutionalized segregation, pushing these minoritized groups into these higher exposure areas. At the same time, when we think about vulnerability, these are also the groups that have less access to resources to adapt and respond to those climate effects. So that's less economic resources, of course, but also less political capital, access to social capital, etc. And as our kind of third layer of vulnerability in this framework, we also know that there's a historic underinvestment in infrastructure in these same communities. So that means that the infrastructure, including housing infrastructure, is often older, up to poorer code standards, using poorer quality materials, etc., which means that the infrastructure itself is more susceptible to damage and more physically vulnerable. So I argue that housing falls squarely in the middle of these overlapping vulnerabilities, and we really need to be thinking about the intersection as we design adaptations and conduct our research. So one framework that has emerged, and I've already heard it brought up several times in the conference so far, is this concept of climate gentrification. And this is one lens for thinking about climate change and housing affordability. I wanted to start by a definition of general gentrification, and I'll say that there's not just one definition, but this is from HUD, and this definition of gentrification defines it as neighborhood change that occurs when high-income groups move to low-income areas, potentially altering the cultural and financial landscape. The most common, or I would say the first definition of climate gentrification, then builds on that definition and defines it as pathways by which climate change could operate to impact geographies and property markets. Now, I want to point out that both of these definitions are a bit sterile and kind of leave the people out of what's actually happening here. Importantly, they leave out the concept of displacement that is really rooted in gentrification. So it's not just that high-income groups move in and neighborhoods change, it's that low-income groups and current residents are displaced from those areas. So you can't see this super well, but this is highlighting the first published example of climate gentrification. So this is a paper by Qian et al. In 2018 that coins this term and then lays out three different mechanisms or pathways by which climate gentrification could occur. They use a case study of Miami-Dade County where they simply look at elevation as a proxy for flood risk and property values. And they find that property values in higher elevation areas were appreciating at a faster rate than property values in lower elevation areas. But I want to highlight these different mechanisms that they posit by which climate gentrification could occur. One is superior investment, which is this concept of high-income households moving from high-risk areas to lower-risk areas, driving up property values and potentially displacing residents. The next is the resilience investment pathway, which is that investments in adaptation and resilience could drive up property values in the places that are benefiting or protected by those resilience investments, displacing people, and then no longer allowing those people to receive the benefits of that resilience investment. And then the cost burden pathway is the idea that high-income households might be the only ones that can afford to stay in high-risk places due to maintenance and repair costs and flood insurance, et cetera. So I was really interested in how this concept has continued to evolve and grow since that 2018 paper, and then talk about some of the gaps that remain. So I conducted a literature review. It was just a simple Web of Science search with climate and gentrification, and I found about 26 articles after doing some screening between 2018, when that Qian et al. Paper came out, and when I finished this lit review last week. And so the first thing I want to point out is that there is a huge range in the methods and metrics that are used in these papers to define and study climate gentrification. So simple regressions to an example of an agent-based model, mapping exercises, qualitative analysis through document analysis, and interviews and focus groups. And there's also a huge range in how the indicators are used to look at climate gentrification. So from the different climate effects that are looked at, everything from, as I mentioned, Qian just using elevation as a proxy for flood exposure, to wildfire risk, to storm frequency. And then we also start to see more socioeconomic indicators coming into these studies as we move further from that Qian paper. So things like race, like socioeconomic status, and looking more at those cultural and socioeconomic shifts. But I mentioned I found 26 papers, and there were, I would say, 26 different ways to operationalize climate gentrification. So I then mapped those different pathways to look at how different pathways are also emerging in the literature. So I mentioned those three pathways that Qian defines, and then placed some of the other papers that I found. So there were several examples of that resilience investment mechanism, but we also saw emerging from that green resilience gentrification and carbon gentrification as different ways that might manifest. And interestingly, we're also starting to see post-disaster gentrification emerging in the literature. And so I'm just going to very briefly highlight two of these examples. And I will say that kind of the point of this is that we see the concept creeping, growing, and the many different mechanisms continuing to be investigated. So the first example is one of post-disaster gentrification, which looked at pre- and post-Katrina New Orleans. And this paper hypothesized that disasters could accelerate gentrification processes by creating new opportunities for investment and repair, and also adding urgency to resilience investments. So this paper did look at several socioeconomic indicators when considering gentrification, and they found that primarily Black and low-income census tracts in New Orleans were eligible for gentrification pre-Katrina and then were gentrified by their definition after Katrina. And these tracts were also significantly higher elevation. And then this last study that I'll spend a little bit of time on is proposing this concept of green resilience infrastructure gentrification, where they looked at investments in green resilience infrastructure in the city of Philadelphia, specifically things like bioswales, gardens, and green flood resilience investments. And they did different mapping exercises to show firstly, that primarily white, higher income communities were receiving most of these resilience investments, but also the lower income, primarily Black communities that received them, they showed between a period of 2000 and 2016 that those areas were gentrifying. And they proposed this framework, and I think it's interesting that they suggest there are several uneven new socio-environmental riskscapes that can emerge from this kind of resilience investment. So kind of bringing it all together, we're seeing this concept of climate gentrification that a lot of us talk about, and it's emerging in both, popular media and the literature is just continuing to grow in scope and complexity. So this was a framework that a colleague and I put together to try to highlight the need to think about climate gentrification across spatial and temporal scales, from historic marginalization, historic exclusion, to future climate impacts and future climate projections, and then from the very local level out to larger market mechanisms that could be driving some of these outcomes. So I think there are a lot of questions that remain that I hope we consider as we move forward in this area. So I mentioned we don't have a good sense of what the right indicators are for climate gentrification or how to measure it. I think a huge overarching question is, how do we disentangle climate gentrification from general gentrification that's occurring with a backdrop of climate change? This has started to emerge in the literature, with some papers even questioning that initial Qian paper and saying that what's happening in Miami is just simple market-driven gentrification and the climate signal isn't being realized yet. How do we, as I mentioned, incorporate these dimensions across spatial and temporal scales in a way that's very true to the place that we're studying? And ultimately, we do this because we are hoping to inform policies that will increase resilience, but also protect against climate gentrification and ensure that vulnerable groups can receive the benefits of that resilience. And I just wanted to leave you with a thought, which is that we also need to be thinking about the ethical dimensions of this research, which is that in conducting this research, we could be sending signals to markets that could have very real impacts on people's property values. Real estate is typically an individual's greatest asset. So how can we handle this information sensitively and present it in a way that doesn't cause harm? So with that, just a reminder that housing justice is climate justice, and thank you for your time. Okay. In the interest of time, I think we'll move on to our next speaker.
I think it's working. So, hello everyone. Thank you for coming to our talk about infrastructure systems. This has. Okay, nice. Thank you. So, what I'm going to be talking about is like a little bit different than what Kelsea did. She talked about like housing, and I'm going to be talking about more transportation access and how it relates to people's like lives and how it might be impacted by the climate change. So, sorry for the technical difficulties, but if you can move along, like I will explain like what's this research about. But basically, the motivation for this research comes from transportation systems are integrated in our lives, and it actually plays an important role of having access to different facilities or different needs, providing, you can go to hospitals, so healthcare access, get to grocery store, so you can get food security, those type of things. That's why we need to look into the intersection of transportation and the risk with the climate risk. Okay, so yeah, I think it's moving now. So basically, what I'm recapping is like trying to understand the sea level rise is a big indicator for risk in the flood risk communities. So there is like studies like showing there's going to be added like almost like 643 minutes of additional commute time to people's like commute to work, which can cause like some loss of like money or like loss of like productivity, those type of things. But also we know the studies focus like Louisiana is one of the most risk-prone areas in the US, coastal US. It has second highest risk of isolation. So like isolation meaning you lose like road access to any kind of like facility, or you cannot leave your home basically. And it's also, this study is motivated by people's concerns, like talking with people in Cameron Parish, which is like the largest parish in Louisiana, but it's losing like population pretty strongly in last couple of years after like hurricanes like they experienced. They mentioned increased driving time to essential services as a big indicator of their loss of quality of life. So we wanted to kind of quantify, can we see which areas are experiencing this risk or this problem like the more? I guess like kind of a little bit more going into that, we wanted to look into this because population change has, I guess, like two indicators regarding the transportation access. The first, you might have a population increase, which means that you have like a strained capacity issues. If you have one hospital serving the entire community, and then you have like more climate migrants coming into that community, you're going to have like capacity issues. How can you accommodate for all the people coming into the place? And also on the flip side, if you have a population decline, that puts a strain on the existing like facilities. Grocery stores might start closing down because like they don't get enough business, or hospital might be closing down. There is not enough people to serve to. So there is like flip side of the both coins, and there is problems for both. And in the 4 communities I'm going to be looking at in this presentation, you can see kind of a diversity of like changes. So some of the communities like Slidell and like Mandeville are increasing like population, but Cameron Parish and Morgan City are decreasing or staying stable. So these are all communities in coastal Louisiana in the flood-prone areas. I guess like 2 research questions in this presentation I'm going to be trying to answer. The first one, can we define like, I guess like fragility based on access to essential services, and how can we do that? And the second is regarding, is there any socio-demographic differences in terms of access or resilience or fragility, however you want to call it. So it's a quick overview of the methods. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically what we did is trying to use like publicly available data sets and then kind of build a network maps to understand, okay, if you have a population group like in a certain node, how far does it take them to drive to nearest hospital, nearest grocery store, or nearest like gas station, those type of things, like trying to look at what are the essential facilities and what each people have to drive to for all of them. So you will have a kind of like a data set of, okay, my closest hospital is in like 10 minutes, like the second is like 20 minutes, or so on and so forth. So, and this is like a really high resolution data, so we might have some population nodes with like 1 or 2 people even in that, so we are trying to capture those differences in the like highest resolution available. And then after that, we built, like, I guess, like, we assign socio-demographic characteristics based on the census block group, and then try to understand, okay, if there's any racial differences in the regional places we are seeing with low access to services. So to account for that, we did some Monte Carlo simulations and trying to get some fragility maps, like which areas are, or which group of people are most prone to risk, or they are in a fragile situation. So I'm diving directly into the results. So I'm going to showing results from the 4 communities I talked about: Slidell, Morgan City, Mandeville, and Cameron Parish. And the first results I'm showing are emergency services. So we have EMS, emergency medical service, and the fire station, like fire truck access. So one thing I wanted to highlight here is, so we are showing access in terms of like one way, and 2 ways actually. The first way is, okay, we have the traditional access, what is the closest location to you, or like what is the closest location the EMS service or fire station truck can come to your home. And then we have the secondary place, so where is the alternative? So what happens to that closest one? What happens to your access? So in Morgan City, for example, we are seeing, in terms of emergency medical service access, we have 70% of the population have a emergency medical service within like 4 minutes, which is the standard time for EMS like response time. And then they also have an alternative. 64% of the population have an alternative also in 4 minutes. So if something happens to the first EMS location, they still have access basically. But the story changes when we look into the other communities. For example, in Slidell, we have similar access level in EMS access to like a primary location. But when we look at the secondary location, we lose almost like, we are at the 36%. So we have only 36% of the people have a secondary EMS location if in the event of an emergency, they can get like service from as well. The fire truck is, since like we have a larger time, it's a little bit better in terms of like how many alternatives you have. And then Mandeville, which is like a kind of like a developing region in like around like north of like New Orleans, is kind of like having similar problems where you have maybe like one service that is serving population as like primary, but then secondary options are not available for people. But the worst place is in the kind of like in terms of fragility is the Cameron Parish, which is a really big rural area. That's why we are seeing the drive times increasing even here. And then you see even like with the fire station access, fire station trucks, it's coming like even longer than 14 minutes, which is the like standard for the rural areas. And it is kind of like a problematic because the Cameron Parish is really prone to like the hurricane risk. So if something happens, like how are people going to get this emergency medical services or like fire stations, fire trucks to come to help them? It's kind of like showing like how fragile these communities are, and this can only get worse with the increasing risk of like climate, as well as the population decline. Maybe some of these services might be closing down, facilities might be closing down, so they're even having a worse access in terms of their emergency services. So looking at hospital access, so like the healthcare, I looked at like hospital and also trauma hospital. The reason for trauma hospital is like, as you might all know, it's where you can get like acute care or like more serious complications, like you can get help for it. So in the Morgan City, we looked at like Morgan City was a good place regarding the emergency services, but in terms of like hospital access, we see actually a big differences. So there are some hospitals or rural health clinics within the 30 minutes time, which is like the general standard for they strive to be when they're building hospitals in the communities. But when you look at the trauma hospitals, like they're almost all the population have to drive like over an hour, and even like secondary options even worse. So it kind of like highlights like how bad in terms of their access to trauma hospitals, even though they have like good emergency medical service access, that doesn't really tell the whole story. Looking more like Slidell is a little bit better, but we see 30 minutes threshold. Again, 91% of the population have a secondary trauma hospital they can go to if something happens to the first one, but it's still kind of like not the best case scenario basically. But for example, Mandeville is, in terms of trauma hospital or hospital access, they do actually have like their 100% of the population have at least 2 alternatives within 30 minutes they can use as a trauma care or acute care type of situation. And again, Cameron Parish is the worst in terms of like these 4 communities. You see only even like 32% of the people have 30 minutes access to like a trauma hospital, like in the best case scenario. And you can see like even the secondary hospital is like 60 minutes, 90 minutes, over 2 hours, like for some population groups or for some regions in the Cameron Parish. So, which is not ideal at all, because like if something happens, you want to get to hospital as fast as possible, so you have a chance of like living or increased chance of living. So this kind of shows like a general region-wide differences, but I also wanted to look into what about like social demographic differences, and this is kind of like shown here. I'm showing in this is the Slidell area, and looking at the closest service for emergency services, and you can see the race groups like differently, and I know some of the race groups are really low sample size, so that might not tell the entire story. But again, we are seeing, when you look at the closest service, all the demographic groups have median below the like 4-minute line, which is like kind of like a good thing. But when you look into the secondary options, like what happens then? Like what are the differences? Because like in general, when you look into access, it's only looked into what is the closest location, but it's not generally considered what are the second closest, or what happens like if that closest location closed down. So I think this is important to highlight the differences between the closest and second closest. And you can see, I'm gonna kind of like back and forth a little bit. So you can see, for example, this is the closest area. Black or African American population have only like maybe 1 outlier node, population node. But when you come into the the second closest, they have larger outliers. So which means that they're increasing risk when you look into fragility or in terms of like alternatives, in terms of like some racial groups. So, and then looking at the trauma hospital in a similar way, we see again, like most of the population in Mandeville this time is like below 30 minutes, which was like what we saw in the previous graphs as well. But when you look into secondary options, like we are seeing like some changes, especially like some shift you can see, which is like expected. But again, I want to highlight the outliers here. For example, Asian population in the closest like trauma hospital, we see a lot of outliers, but then we don't see any outliers in the second closest. That means like there are more clustering with these like population groups, so there might be different indicators we need to look into regarding their access. So kind of this is like showing some of the results this study is trying to achieve, like trying to identify fragility in terms of alternatives. So not just like the closest location. So we know like those areas are prone to risk, and they can get shut down or something can happen like population change, they have capacity issues. So it's important to understand resilience in terms of alternatives and what is the marginal time to drive to the secondary option. So some conclusions from just like brief presentation. So we look into EMS and trauma hospital access. Closest, defining the access as the closest location doesn't really tell the entire story, because these are, flood risk areas. These are like prone to hurricanes. So it's not just the access to closest location, it's also the access to alternatives. So people can actually sustain their lives like if something happens. The secondary kind of like, I guess like a subplot of that is, we know like large percentage of people do not have alternatives, so just dedicating them, okay, they have access, they're all good, we don't have to think about them, is kind of like a mistake. So we cannot just do that. We need to keep thinking about what happens to these people if there is a complication that happen or if these situation changes. And we also see some areas with the population decline. Cameron Parish and Morgan City are more fragile in terms of like trauma hospital access, which kind of makes sense because you are expecting it's a rural area, you don't have that many hospitals. So, but again, what happens to these people if they have to seek care? Like, how do they get transported to the nearest trauma hospital? Is there like a way for them to air travel, or is it land travel? So we need to look into these kind of like different combinations of access to understand what happens to these people who decide to stay in these areas And then do they just not have a quality of life? Do they just like suffer from complications? So I think it's important to understand, identify those regions and what can we do about those. And then looking at the access to first and second locations, again, we see some differences. For example, I highlighted Asian populations, like EMS becomes worse when looking at the second closest, but when they looking at the trauma hospital, it becomes like better. So there are like differences in like for access in terms of different essential service and different regions. So we need to be looking at it not just like a one homogeneous kind of solution, looking at region specific. Maybe local planners need to like look into these issues more carefully and then see what they need and what their community needs to address these I guess like problems or fragility we are highlighting here. And then, as I also highlighted, Black or African American population have more outliers when looking at the second closest trauma hospital, which kind of indicates like we might look into. I'm going to come back a little bit. So we might look into these plots, and then they're like, okay, we don't have any equity problems, but when you look into more in depth and also understand some racial groups are less likely to own a car because this is only looking at the driving time, it's kind of like becomes like a situation. We cannot just say, okay, we don't have equity issues based on looking at the access in a closest location way, I guess. Ooh. Okay, and then two implications I'm kind of finishing this presentation with is it is important to, I think, like look into like secondary, tertiary, or like the other alternatives for essential services, not just like looking at the closest location. So and defining, okay, these people have resilience, they have hospital, they have everything within like critical time threshold. It's not about that. It's looking at what happens in a worst case scenario. What happens if that place closed down? Like, how do they handle that? Like what are the alternative options? So looking into these alternatives and kind of like a preparedness, I think, is an important aspect of this. And then second is, I kind of mentioned that like we look at different racial groups and their access to different services, but we also know there are like systemic inequities already existing. So maybe some racial groups are less likely to own a car. So these study results might not indicate exactly what those like groups are experiencing. So it's important to understand those I guess like those already existing inequities, and then how does this add up onto that? So we have a kind of more comprehensive understanding of inequities or equities. So future work kind of focusing on that is looking at different social demographic characteristics. It's not only the race that we need to be focusing on in terms of equity. We have like income disparity, we have age disparity. Older population need access to hospital or like maybe nursing homes, but they might not need access to daycares or schools. So it's understanding like specific to need, like, and if there is like any issues regarding those populations who are in need of those services. And then looking at, and I'm also looking for some feedback regarding the second point, how can we define the general resilience of these different regions or different population groups, like looking at, because we have the marginal time, from the closest, second closest, and we also have alternatives. So how many alternatives they have within, critical time threshold. So we have other measures like that. So trying to combine those as like a combined resiliency index, like, or resilience against fragility index. So I'm looking for feedback. If you have any ideas, please come find me after and we can talk more about it. And also expanding the analysis in the entire coastal areas. This is just for Louisiana. We are seeing this in the Louisiana, but maybe what happens in the other coastal areas, like especially even other rural areas that might have issues regarding access already. Are there also issues regarding fragility? So with that, I'm gonna conclude my presentation with some acknowledgements, and I would like to thank the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine for funding this project, as well as our colleagues in Walter Institute of Gulf, and also my advisor, David Johnson, sitting, and he will be presenting later. So thank you very much for attention, and I'm gonna pass it. And this is my email if you have any questions or if you would like to connect me, and I'm gonna just pass it along to the next presenter.
Yeah, so our next speaker wasn't able to be here, but she kindly shared a video of her talk. So we can go ahead and play that.
Hello everyone, my name is Qian He. I am an assistant professor at Rowan University with the Department of Geography, Planning and Sustainability. It's a great pleasure for me today to present our work on how do presidential declared disasters and federal aid programs affect renters' eviction rates with longitudinal evidence from the United States. I'm presenting on behalf of our team with Dr. Kelsea at The Ohio State University, Dr. Allison Riley, and Dr. Daphne Meyer at the University of Maryland. Global climate change is altering the frequency and intensity of many natural hazards and extreme weather events. Within the year 2023 alone, we have had many billion-dollar weather and climate disasters in the United States, as we can see from this map that include California flooding, Northeast winter storm, central tornado weathers, as well as in the south and eastern shore of the United States, among many others. So with the increased intensity and impact of climate change, scholars are more and more aware of the importance of looking at the intersection of social justice and climate resilience. One example is how compounded vulnerability can be really happening under the impact of climate-related factors. As we all know, our communities and infrastructure are planned and built based on human decisions, and human beings are not perfect. With that being said, we have made mistakes in our history, with the example of environmental racism in urban planning practice such as redlining, that really excludes certain racial and ethnic groups from seeking residential opportunities within the designated hazard and dangerous zone. Climate factors could exacerbate existing social inequality through infrastructure and urban planning decisions, where socially vulnerable populations, including Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and more, are likely to experience more severe impacts of climate change with less resources to adapt and respond. And we have seen this too often, that when disaster event happens, people who are already in disadvantaged status are the ones who get hit the most, such as in Hurricane Harvey. And thinking a little bit more from infrastructure and urban policy perspective, one prominent factor that we see on a day-to-day basis that our vulnerable communities struggle with is housing rights. Housing is a human right. However, more than 2 million evictions were being filed, and there are nearly 900,000 evictions actually occur every year, disproportionately affecting Black, Indigenous, people of color households, according to the data from Eviction Lab in Princeton University in 2023. As we can see from this map, which is pulled in with both eviction data source as well as the American Community Survey, evictions are common throughout many parts of the country, but particularly those places with larger percentage of African American populations. With all this background information, we want to talk a little bit more about the motivation of this work. As we know that consequences of climate-related disasters and factors can have cascading effects on social well-being and equity, including by exacerbating vulnerabilities in the built environment. Also, socially disadvantaged populations are prone to experience the most severe impacts of climate change and natural hazards and have the fewest available resources to adapt and respond to these effects. We also see that natural hazards may disrupt the well-being, especially for socially disadvantaged groups, through disruptions to housing security, leading to housing affordability issue and eviction risk, which is what we're examining in this work. Speaking of the data and methodology, we constructed a 10-year panel data set for every county in 19 states along the U.S. East Coast and Gulf of Mexico, including a range of socio-demographic data, disaster-related federal aid, as well as disaster characteristic, in this case, hurricanes. We extracted the hurricane factors from the Presidential Disaster Declaration in Open FEMA dataset, including both hurricane frequency, which is the number of hurricanes happening within certain county year, as well as the maximum sustained wind speed. We created 1 and 2 year time lags for both of the variables to capture potentially lagged effects. In terms about the federal aid, we pull in FEMA individual assistance, public assistance, hazard mitigation assistance, as well as a community development block grant disaster recovery money from HUD. We aggregated those into county level to construct the panel dataset. We used the dataset from Eviction Lab at Princeton University to capture the eviction risk. And in this case, we used both eviction filings as well as eviction threats that were received by renter households. Eviction threats measure if a household has received more than 1 eviction orders within the past year. That helps us to capture the nuanced risk that's being faced by renter households, which previous work has not been able to do so because of the lack of data source. And within American Community Survey, we used the 5-year estimate to pull in social demographic factors, including gross median rents, percentage white and median income, as well as housing variables, including percentage of renters, percentage of vacant property, percentage of crowding living, as well as housing units per capita. And given that coastal residential properties are more likely to suffer more significant damages due to the hurricane-related hazards, we use a coastal damming variable to differentiate coastal counties with other inland counties to control for spatial heterogeneity in risk exposure. And in terms of our modeling, we use a 2-stage random effect modeling approach. The instrumental variable, in our case, median rent price, allows us to address the problem of omitted variable biases, which is the effect of hurricane events and public aid on renters' eviction risk. To identify this potential effect of hurricane and public aid's impact on rental prices and ultimately on eviction risk, we specified 2-stage least square panel regression models using the following instrumental variables in addition to rent. That includes the hurricane frequency with 1 and 2 year lag variables, maximum wind speed with 1 and 2 year variables, in addition to the summarized public aid amount. And after checking the multicollinearity between the modeling variables, we then use median rent as instrumental estimator with random effect specification. That is, we assume that rent price is an endogenous variable to eviction risk with hurricane characteristics as well as public aid as exogenous variables to eviction risk. And in other words, this model construction allows us to test our hypothesis that hurricane intensity and public aid can influence renters' eviction risk through their impact on market rent price. And here in this map, we can see the log mean annual eviction filings across counties within our study area from 2009 to 2018, which is showing us that there is significant spatial heterogeneity of evictions during the time period, with higher level of eviction risk appearing along the East Coast. Now we have the results from our 2-stage random effect model. Within stage 1, using log median rent as the instrumental variable. We could see that hurricanes in a given year are correlated with an immediate decrease in rent prices, while the number of hurricanes has 1-year lag effect on increasing the rent prices. And we also find a similarly lagged effect with the maximum sustained wind speed, with stronger wind speeds corresponding to increase in rent prices after 2 years, despite an initial decrease in the year of hurricane. And we also see that the coastal counties are experiencing a positive association with rent increase. And we also see that the aggregated amount from federal aid program is also positive related to the increase of rent. And our stage 2 model results demonstrates that an increase in rental prices will then correspond to both an increase in eviction filings as well as eviction threat. So when we take the results from stage 1 model and stage 2 together, our findings show that hurricanes have a 1-year lagged effect on increasing the rental prices and lead to both more eviction filings as well as eviction threat, despite an initial calming effect on rents as the year of disaster. And recalling the finding from stage 1 model, we also find that counties on the coastal side correlate with significantly higher rent prices, leading to higher levels of eviction filing as well as eviction threat. And our finding also shows that a community's housing profile also has an important effect on post-disaster eviction risk. More specifically, models of both eviction filing and threats show that a significant and negative relationship between percentage of vacant housing properties and eviction risk. So households renting in counties with fewer vacant housing units experience a greater risk of post-disaster eviction filings and threat, while greater damage to housing reduces supply, that's contributing to higher rent prices and greater evictions. More vacant housing units can work to alleviate this tension on post-disaster housing supply, that's moderating the rent increases from our hypothesis. And last but not least, how does the amount of federal aid that a county receives can influence the rates for eviction water and eviction threats? From our results of stage 1, we see that the total amount of aid received by a county in a year of a hurricane leads to an increase in rent prices, and then in turn can lead to increases in eviction filing and eviction threats. The more federal aid received by a county from our study is more likely indicating that it will experience an increase in rent, which leads to higher eviction risk for renters. And this result is somehow surprising and counter to results reported in previous work from Brennan et al. In 2022. However, as we mentioned, previous work in this area have focused specifically on the role of renter assistance aid, whereas our analysis consider federal aid more than just one program, which is more comprehensively measuring the multiple federal aid programs. So it makes sense that renter assistance should reduce the risk of eviction, as renter assistance will work to address the challenges of increased rental prices. However, our results is suggesting that other federal aid that is not exclusively going to rent assistance could operate in unintended ways to increase the risk faced by renters in terms of eviction. So a quick summary of our findings. We see that increases in rental prices are associated with increase in both eviction filings and eviction threats post-disasters. And hurricanes, as well as higher maximum sustained wind speeds, have a lag effect on increasing rental prices, which then lead to more eviction filings and threats, despite an initial calming effect in mediating aftermath of disaster. And we also see that coastal counties have a higher rent prices overall, leading to further risk of higher eviction filing and eviction threats. And again, public aid amount received by a county in this study is found to be associated with higher rent and then increasing eviction risk. So some brief takeaways based on this work. We want to argue that climate adaptation plans and infrastructure projects need to center on people and the vulnerability of people and who might be left behind were put into a more disadvantaged place because of our decisions and public policies to address climate adaptation and disaster events. And undoing historical injustice requires contextual understanding of our neighborhood vulnerabilities as well as lived experiences facing climate challenge. We also argue that coordinated public policies as well as well-targeted aid programs, specifically after disaster events, are necessary to ensure that at-risk communities such as renters, especially those who are at repeated eviction risk, have access to sufficient financial resources as well as legal support. and urban planning decisions such as comprehensive plan, zoning, etc., as well as community development policies need to consider the social justice and equity outcome. And with that, we'd like to gratefully acknowledge the funding support of our founders, and any opinions and findings, recommendations presented in this work are based on author's opinion. Thank you again for this opportunity to share our work here, and we look forward to hearing your questions and discussions. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to email me at the email address here or connect with me through Twitter. Thank you.
All right, and now we're back to being live. Thanks for being here. My name is David Johnson. I'm an associate professor at Purdue University. That's actually the first time I've introduced myself as an associate professor now, but yeah, thanks. So I'm going to be talking about a new metric that was developed for Louisiana's 2023 Coastal Master Plan, and some of the analysis that we've done subsequent to that Coastal Master Plan to look at how robust the evaluation of different structural or non-structural risk reduction projects would be to using different ways of evaluating their effectiveness. So the motivation for this is something that I think a lot of us are aware of, that a traditional benefit cost analysis can lead to inequitable outcomes, because when we are thinking about a benefit cost analysis and putting everything in monetary terms, that means that all else equal, it becomes more attractive to protect more valuable assets. And so using a traditional benefit cost analysis can exacerbate existing inequities and lead to underinvestment in poorer communities because they don't have the big fancy houses that increase your benefit cost ratios. So we wanted to look at ways of addressing that problem, but it's challenging for policymakers to do so when they don't have tools to do that in a data-driven analytic way. So the traditional approach, this is what feeds into our benefit cost analysis, is what we think of as direct economic damage. This is essentially taking the replacement cost or the value of an asset. In this example, we're going to talk about single-family homes. So replacement cost of the homes, and then you multiply it by basically what's the average amount of damage or proportion of the damage that would be experienced over time. So we're essentially just calculating the expected damage in monetary terms over some planning horizon. Okay, so the equation is there, but that's the concept of what we're looking at, is just what's the expected damage over some planning horizon of T years. But that all starts with the replacement cost, and that's what skews our benefit cost ratios. That if that value goes up, then the expected benefits of providing protection to that asset go up as well. But that's what leads to our inequity. And so we had the simple idea of just leaving that out of the equation. We have essentially the same calculation, but we're not multiplying it by the replacement cost of the asset. Or equivalently, we're pretending as if all assets had the same value. So we're kind of normalizing it for the value of the asset. And now we can think of this as the expected damage over a planning horizon, but as a proportion of the structure's value instead of converting it to monetary value itself. And if you conduct a benefit cost analysis based on this new metric, then the interpretation is a little bit different. We would traditionally think of the standard benefit cost analysis as being something where we're seeking to mitigate risk to houses and protecting the value of those houses. But using this new approach, which we'll call resident equivalent losses, it seeks to mitigate risk to households. So it's treating all households as if they have the same innate value. And it puts lower income communities on an even footing, or we think that it should, right? So the analysis that we've done here is based on real structure inventory data and real hazard information from Louisiana's 2023 Coastal Master Plan, which is a 50-year, $50 billion set of investments in risk reduction and coastal protection, or coastal restoration. And we're basing our analysis on projected risk in the year 2070. So this is the end of the planning horizon that the state uses, both with and without mitigation in the form of other levee projects or flood walls being put in place. We calculate the cost effectiveness of two different mitigation targets for elevating people's houses. One is based on the 100-year flood, or a 1% annual exceedance probability as it exists today on the coastal landscape, plus 2 additional feet of freeboard. So we're saying if your house foundation, your first floor elevation is below that 100-year flood depths and 2 additional feet for safety, then we would elevate that house and calculate what's the cost effectiveness in terms of the reduced risk per dollar of cost. Okay. The alternative is looking at how that 100-year flood depths might change in the future. And so we also looked at 100-year flood depths projected 30 years from now in 2050, plus 2 feet of freeboard as well. And we took a total budget that corresponds to Louisiana's budget for non-structural elevation or elevation projects or buyouts over the next 20 years, so about $3.5 billion. And we allocate that budget by rank ordering single-family homes according to their cost effectiveness. Okay? And that cost effectiveness can either be based on the direct economic damage, that traditional benefit cost analysis component, or this residence equivalent losses, or a weighted average of both. And what that represents would be decision makers that have preferences for one standard economic efficiency or potentially equity, or some preference for using both of those measures. Okay. So we wanted to look at how much risk you can actually reduce using each of those strategies, look at what the trade-off is, how much do those strategies vary depending on what your decision maker preferences are for equity versus efficiency, and then look at who is actually affected, who receives funding for mitigation, and how much variation is there across different sociodemographic groups. So this is the trade-off. Okay, so we've got on the x-axis, the horizontal, this is reduction in risk according to these residence equivalent losses. On the vertical axis, this is reduction in percentage terms on the direct economic damage measure. And then the color indicates how much you care about the traditional economic efficiency versus the equity-based measure that we introduced. So yellow indicates putting more weight on this new equity-based measure that treats all households as if they have the same value. Okay. So up in the top left, that's our traditional benefit cost analysis, where we put all of our weight on the direct economic damage and trying to reduce that as much as possible under our budget constraint. We can see that there is a sharp trade-off, and that if decision makers are willing to give up some measure of economic efficiency, they can actually reduce the economic efficiency, the risk reduction by 1 percentage point, and in exchange, you gain approximately 4.2 percentage points of reduction in this measure that treats all households as if they have the same value. So if you care a little bit about what I'm calling an equity-focused measure that treats everyone as if they have the same value to their household, then you can do a lot better in terms of the risk reduction that you receive. And we want to see how that accumulates to different communities across the Louisiana coast. Okay? So if we look at how much these policies vary across the 52 different policies that we looked at, depending on how much we weight one measure versus the other, only half of the homes are selected for mitigation in all strategies. So there is some variation in who gets funding, depending on your preferences. And about a quarter of homes that appear in at least one strategy are included in less than half of the strategies. Okay? So that means that we want to look more closely at how things change depending on your preferences. And if you focus on reducing residence equivalent losses, that has the impact of spreading your investment across the coast a little bit more. So this is a map of where there are communities that see at least $1 million in expenditure. If you focus solely on direct economic damage, this is our traditional benefit cost analysis. If you then instead focus solely on reducing this residence equivalent losses measure, then we see that the western half of the state starts to get some funding. And we actually also see some increased investment in some areas in the northeast corner, which is the Slidell community that Utku talked about in his presentation. So we can also then look at how allocation of funds vary across income levels and see where the trade-off is across different income levels, across different racial groups, and across the rural and urban divide. Here, what we've done is divided households into 4 groups by their poverty income ratio. So each household has a poverty threshold that depends on how many children, how many family members there are, et cetera. And so a larger number, greater than 2, that means that this household has an income at least twice as much as their poverty threshold. So these are more well-to-do relative to households with a smaller number. And if we look at this trade-off plot, this is looking at the same strategies as before, and the axes and the colors indicate the same things as before, but we've just stratified this by income ratio. And what we see is that there's really only a trade-off for households with a poverty income ratio over 2. For all of the other income groups, if you care more about this equity-focused measure, then it's almost Pareto improving for all of those. So lower income households do better in terms of their risk reduction on both measures if policymakers care more about this new equity-focused measure of cost effectiveness. Okay. So the trade-off is only for more affluent communities. If we look across different racial groups, we have a similar set of traces. Here we have more categories. So now the size of the dot indicates the weight on our equity measure. So where we see the larger kind of traces of our comet, that's where we focus more on equity. The smaller tail of the comet is where we focus more on traditional economic efficiency. And here there's a little bit more of a mixed story. For some racial groups, there's still a Pareto improvement the more you care about equity compared to efficiency, but there are trade-offs associated with the risk reduction, particularly for Asian communities, predominantly Asian or predominantly white neighborhoods. If we then also do the same sort of thing looking at urban versus rural communities, then we see that there are trade-offs with both, but that you start to see more investment in rural communities if you care more about the equity-focused measure of cost effectiveness. Okay. Generally, there's less risk reduction in rural communities because they have a higher baseline of risk, so it's harder to do something for them and reduce that risk. That's why there's an overall disparity, but there's a trade-off between both. So kind of the implications of this are that cost effectiveness based on this new equity metric that treats all households as if they have the same value suggests that this could correct for some historic inequities in provision of protection services without explicitly incorporating household level characteristics into your evaluation process. So nowhere in this analysis did we actually use the poverty income ratio or the racial characteristics of the households. We just looked at what the outcomes would be if you were either optimizing for traditional benefit cost ratios or this residence equivalent losses based cost effectiveness. So you don't have to incorporate those household level characteristics into the analysis, but it improves outcomes for traditionally more vulnerable communities. And that allows decision makers to be data-driven in their approach without sounding political. Okay? I think a lot of decision makers understand that some communities are disadvantaged and have had historic underinvestment, but they would face an uphill battle politically to do something about it if they were explicitly incorporating those characteristics into their analysis, or it would appear as if they were putting their thumb on the scale, even if they were trying to correct the thumb being on the scale throughout history, right? This may also be useful for accounting more generally for differences in home values between urban and rural areas, but there are still some challenges, so I'll just kind of end with this, that comparisons across asset classes have limited interpretability here, so it makes sense when you're just looking at single-family homes, but comparing residential assets to commercial assets would still be challenging. The demographic data, of course, are not always available at structure levels or household levels. And we also have the complexities that Kelsea has talked about dealing with renter versus owner-occupied housing units, or also dealing with multifamily units with this type of analysis. But I think this is a promising way to start. Okay. So this was actually used in Louisiana's 2023 Coastal Master Plan, which I was extremely proud of. I'm happy to answer more questions about how policymakers actually thought about this, or if you have any comments, definitely open to feedback. But want to acknowledge Louisiana CPRA, the Water Institute of the Gulf, as well as some other collaborators for funding and kind of the intellectual capital in developing these ideas. So thank you so much.
Here we are. Okay. Hi, I'm Allison Riley. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, the Department of Civil Environmental Engineering. I understand that I stand between you and lunch, so I will try to move it along, but thank you for being here. I'm excited. Okay, so I wanted to talk today about a couple different projects that we have going on, looking at infrastructure reliability and the burden of sea level rise. So I'll really be focusing on sea level rise. I work in Maryland. Sea level rise, as I will show you, is a big, extensive problem in the state, and so I focus a lot of my research there. And really, I want to look at current planning metrics that we're using. Are we really capturing this burden of sea level rise as measured through infrastructure reliability? So I love infrastructure. I can geek out to it all day long. Please join me afterwards to do so. But I also, while I'm here, want to also acknowledge a number of my collaborators on this work, including Kelsea, who is sitting here, Qian, who also has presented today, Deb Niemeyer, who's sitting in the audience. Okay. So many of you have seen studies like this. This is based on the Zillow study in 2016. Sea level rise is expected to inundate more than 1 million homes in the United States by 2100. So Florida is one of the leaders. Nearly 1 million homes are expected to be inundated. So this is a picture of an inundated home. This is probably tidal flooding, sunny day flooding this is probably the Northeast somewhere. And we can see in many states will be affected, with Florida being unfortunately in the leaderboard here. Okay, and so there have been many studies that have looked at household inundation, right? And we could see this. This is a study 2022 that came out. NOAA really heavily publicized this. This is NOAA-funded research, looking at different cities, looking at the distribution of properties, of who will be inundated under what sea level rise scenarios, all very solid work. So on that side, they look on the left-hand side, you see Florida or Miami, Newport, California, Atlantic City, Galveston. What you do is you take sea level rise scenarios, right, overlay it on properties, and figure out who's going to be inundated when, right? Very important work. This has led to a lot of Matt Hauer's work and other work on displacement of saying, okay, so when we know who's going to be inundated when, that's going to force migration, right? And it's absolutely true. I have seen many homes in Maryland, I will show you some photos shortly, that are inundated. You can't live in a home that is wet all the time. So a lot of Matt Hauer's work is based on this idea and notion of property inundation. When will people be forced to relocate? We see by 2100, depending on the climate change scenario, you might expect up to 13, 14 million US Americans forced to be displaced, primarily in Florida, but all across the coastline. Okay, so these metrics, which are ultimately derived from housing, it is important, are common for understanding, as we know, and planning for climate migration. We're using these in climate adaptation, these metrics in climate adaptation today. So, if you look and read like a lot of the literature, many adaptation policy discussions, when we're talking about can we have adaptation policy, a lot of it are based on these metrics, household inundation and when people will be forced to relocate. So like dynamic adaptive pathway planning, a lot of it uses household inundation. Some nations and US states are relying on this approach. So if you look at part of New Zealand's national adaptation strategy, it's using a number of these metrics about when households will be inundated. It is reasonable, it is defensible, it is easy to explain, right, to policymakers when we think about adaptation, who is going to be forced to relocate. And I, as an infrastructure nerd, really like to think about, well, what else is going to be affected by sea level rise, and how does that, and what else do people need in order to stay in their house, to stay in their home? And it's not just housing. You need reliable power, you need access to drinking water, you need access to wastewater and waste removal, you need road access, access to emergency services. So that's what we look at in my research group. So we know that sea level rise will significantly impact multiple forms of infrastructure beyond housing. We know that. So looking at road flooding, there's been a number of good studies looking at how Genc has looked really at road flooding and how much additional travel time will be required due to tidal flooding. Emergency management, wastewater. Michelle Hummel has done some great work looking at how wastewater, like in different areas in the United States, which wastewater treatment facilities will be inundated by sea level rise. It's a problem. We know that, right? We can look at that. But very few studies have looked at what does it mean for provision of service? How do those network effects, when you look at the interaction of networked infrastructure with where people live, with where seas will rise, how will that affect the reliability and the provision of service to the end user? And so that's what we're looking at here. And so it's not really always clear when this loss of residential support for infrastructure will begin to burden communities. And so let me go here. Let me actually go back one more slide. So I just want to talk about I'll talk about it in a moment with roads. Okay, so a lot of the work I look at is in Maryland. I'm going to talk about first Maryland and then also the coast of the United States. So there's 7,719 miles of coastline in the state of Maryland. It is a ground zero for sea level rise. So like about 12,000 kilometers of coastline. It's an incredible area on the Eastern Shore where I work. I really encourage everyone to travel there. It's beautiful. It has important historical and cultural significance. It's where the Underground Railroad was. Harriet Tubman's has a new national park there. It is incredible. It also is really burdened by sea level rise. It is completely flat. It's a few feet above sea level currently. The it's dotted by ghost forests. The first instance in Maryland of collective relocation happened 120 years ago. So its collective relocation has been occurring in the state of Maryland for decades. And is expected to continue. If you look at studies of like looking at Tangier Island, if you've heard of that island, looking because of the threat of sea level rise. Okay. So sunny day flooding is increasingly common in Maryland. It's forced adaptation on the Eastern Shore. Emergency services, the shifts are dictated by tides to make sure people can get to work. So there is adaptation happening now. Most people are buying bigger and bigger cars because in order to make sure you can reliably get to places. The state is actively producing laws and guidance related to sea level rise. The county that I work in primarily, Dorchester County, it's the second largest land mass-wise county in Maryland. Under most sea level rise scenarios, it'll lose at least 60% of its land mass by 2100. So massive loss of land is expected. Okay, so in Maryland, 3,700 miles of roadway is expected to be inundated by 5 feet of sea level rise. In parts of Dorchester County right now, you have more than 6 feet in parts of Dorchester County of pavement. And then when you have that much pavement, like that's much taller than I am, it makes it heavier and it makes sinking of the roads more rapid. So it is really not a great situation. There's already divestment occurring in the transportation in roads already because they simply cannot continue to pay for investment in road infrastructure. Okay, so, but what will this loss of roadways mean for residents? What will it mean, right? So we wanted to know that. So we used accessibility metric, was already talked about today. Basically, how can people get from their home to a grocery store, to, we looked at grocery store, hospital, fire station, school, under different sea level rise scenarios. And at what point will they no longer be able to get to that place? It's a commonly used metric in urban planning and transportation and equity. You've probably heard of food deserts. This is how we figure out where food deserts are located. Can people get to a grocery store, and how long does that take if they can get there? It's shockingly uncommon in the disaster science and adaptation literature. Okay, so why is it important? So having access to a location gives you social and economic opportunities. It reduces without access, it reduces your urgent ability to get to medical care, makes your location less desirable to live. And this is also really not really appreciated, I think. When there is flooding of roads, there's a lot of co-located infrastructure, right? And so if you look at water systems, if you have a saturated water system or like water pipes, or with sea level rise touching the concrete a lot, you get a lot more corrosion of the pipes, you have more pipe breaks. Pipe breaks are the second leading cause of gastrointestinal illness in the United States, behind food poisoning. So it is a public health issue. Also co-located are electric power lines. When you have poles in saturated soil, they cause the system or the poles to fall over more quickly and become a less reliable system. So it's not only the road flooding, but also what does it mean for other infrastructure services? So we looked at not only Dorchester County, but for the entire United States, and looked at how, and I'll go through both studies very quickly with the results, but how for different sea level rise scenarios, how does this affect people's ability simply to get to their school, a grocery store, and different fire stations? And so this is Dorchester County. This is a road network, and these are fire stations there, just as a FYI. So we can see. So red means no access, 2030, 2050, and then two sea level rise scenarios for two different RCPs for 2080 and 2100. And we can see along the coastline, we lose access starting in 2030, which is expected. 2050, it becomes quite a number of people. So this is just access, and then longer travel times are in the green. And so we can look at also the distribution of the changes in people who have access. But this is not actually what I want to talk about. This is what I want to talk about. So what is the difference in time between when a house becomes flooded and when a house loses access to a location, to a grocery store? Due to sea level rise. And so we map this out spatially for here. Red, like the sharpest red is when the house is inundated, they can't also leave their house. But there is this huge distribution in Dorchester County, up to 130 years, that we find difference between when a house they lose access and when their house is inundated. So this is the distribution. For about 40% of homes lose access when their house is inundated, but the 60% of homes have a forewarning period of when they're unable to get to just standard public accommodations. We then took this study, looked at all of the coastal counties and parcels of the United States in coastal counties, and then compared it with when we expect inundation of households to begin, compared it to what will be isolated and when, who will be isolated and when. And we see about, with different sea level rise scenarios, pretty consistently, about by by 2100, about 5 million additional people being at risk for inundation, being unable to get from their home to some public accommodation. And we can look at it by state. The risk, I'm just trying to go through this. We have a website here with our results. Kelsea has a nice paper who's looking at who has been impacted by this. We see that white populations tend to be overburdened with less sea level rise, but as sea level rise increases, Black and Hispanic populations tend to be overburdened. And I'm not going to get into this. But anyways, I just wanted to wrap up with just, it's noon, it's lunchtime, and we can have some questions. But when we're thinking about how to plan and what our trigger points are, I do think we need to be really cognizant of how infrastructure will behave under sea level rise, under also other climate change conditions like heat. And will people in their homes be able to stay there because they have provision of these infrastructure services? So with that, I know it's noon, so I think it is lunchtime, but we are happy to stick around for questions. And thank you.
Yeah, I think we don't have time for questions, but obviously all of us really like talking about this, so I'll speak for all of us and say, come find us during lunch or later during the conference. So thank you all for being here.